Okay, so we're doing our second panel now. We're just going to save all the questions until the end when everyone comes up on stage for the panel. The first speaker will be Dr. Stephen Omohundro. He's the president of Self-Aware Systems, focusing on software that can improve itself, that can understand its own behavior and work to improve itself. He is a very deep thinker as well on these subjects, and we'll be talking about the nature of self-improving AI. I'm glad to say that we have Stephen involved in the Institute as an advisor, and we're learning a lot from him. So I'm looking forward to hearing this talk. Come on out, Stephen.
So I'd like to talk about the nature of self-improving AI, nature as in human nature. Self-improving AI is a system that understands its own behavior, that understands all of its operation and is able to make changes to itself to hopefully improve itself. It's the kind of thing that my company, Self-Aware Systems, is working on, and a number of other research groups, some of whom are represented here. But I don't want to talk about the specifics of our system. I want to talk in general about any system that has that character. And as we see, as we go into it, essentially any system which acts in a rational way will want to self-improve itself. And so this should be a very general kind of a description. There's a quote that Eliezer mentioned from Irving Good in 1965. An ultra-intelligent machine could design even better machines. There would then unquestionably be an intelligence explosion, and the intelligence of man would be left far behind. Thus, the first ultra-intelligent machine is the last invention that man need ever make. So these are strong words. If this is even remotely true, it means that this kind of technology has the potential to dramatically change every aspect of human life and of the world. And so we need to think very carefully as we move into developing it. When is it going to happen? We don't know. There's a lot of opinions here. Ray Kurzweil's book is sort of serving as a kind of a touchstone, and he predicts somewhere in 10 to 40 years. I don't know if that's true, but even if there's just the remotest possibility that it could be happening in that time, then I think it's absolutely essential that we understand in detail what we're getting into so that we can shape this technology to push it in a direction that really preserves the human values we most care about. So what's it going to be like, this self-improving AI? At first, you might think it might be extremely unpredictable, because if you understand today's version, it improves itself, you might understand the new version. So it could be going off in some completely wild direction. What we'll see from the analysis I'm going to present, oh, and I should say there's a paper I wrote that you should have gotten coming in that goes into these arguments in much more detail, and it has an appendix that actually gives all the mathematics behind them. So if you want to really delve into it, you can read that. What do we expect? If you look backwards at popular media images of this kind of thing, I mean, it's been something ever since the time of golems and Prometheus that has been something that humanity has thought about, giving life, giving sort of independent volition to his artifacts. It's not a very promising thing when we look at the popular media images. We have things like, it could be like a Frankenstein or the Sorcerer's Apprentice, or giant robots spitting fire from their mouths. Are any of these realistic? How can we look forward? What tools can we use to understand? We need some kind of a theory, some kind of a science that helps us put into context the likely outcomes. Fortunately, just such a science was developed starting in the 1940s by von Neumann and Morgenstern. John von Neumann is behind so many, not only the computer and this and quantum mechanics and mathematical logic and a lot of insights into the game theory behind these things. Very powerful, and we'll see in a minute that his ideas about economics play directly into the nature of these kinds of systems. His work with Morgenstern was primarily dealing with situations with objective probability, and I'll say more about what that is. It was extended by Savage and Anscombe and Aumann to situations where systems only have partial information about the world. But it has developed into what's become the foundational theory of microeconomics that's in every graduate economics text. The rational economic agent that they described is sometimes called Homo economicus. Sort of an ironic name because it actually doesn't describe human behavior very well. And in fact, more recently, an entire subfield of economics has arisen called behavioral economics that tries to see what humans actually do. but we'll see that it actually should be a much better description of AIs than it is of people. So let me start by saying what it is. What is this rational economic behavior? From enough of a distance, it actually just sounds like common sense. So the basic structure, how you make a decision in the world, is that you have some clearly specified goals. You identify the possible actions that you're trying to choose between. For each of those possible actions, you consider the consequences. And the consequences won't just be the immediate consequences, but you also look down the line. You see what things might come, what ramifications might follow from your action. You consider that action which is most likely, in your assessment, to meet your goals. And then, oops, lost her. Can you hear it? There we go, OK. And then based on what the world actually does, you improve and you update your world model so that you're continually learning in this process. It sounds very simple. At this level, it's hard to see how you could do anything different. To actually make that formal, and I won't go into the formal mathematics too much, but just to give you the key sort of mathematical entities that arise when building a system this way, there are two fundamental things that a rational economic agent has to have. It's got to have a utility function, which is something that encodes the preferences of that agent, and it has to have a subjective probability distribution, which encodes the beliefs of that agent. And one of the key things in this model is that those two things are quite separate from one another. They're represented separately, and they apply in very separate ways. In the mathematical structure, the agent then chooses the action that has the highest expected utility, highest average of his utility. If you think about, say, a chess-playing program, his utility function might be, if you look at the entire history of a particular history of the universe, he prefers a history in which he wins lots of games. So his utility function might be add up how many games I won in that history. And the prescription, the sort of intuitive prescription, leads to some amazing consequences, as we'll see in a little bit. And so it sounds so simple and easy at this level, it's sometimes hard to see the connection. But let me sort of emphasize that for an agent that is behaving in this way, the way that you decide whether it's going to do something or not is you consider the consequences of it doing that, and you see if its expected utility, its value for what's important, goes up by doing it. And if it is, that's what it's going to do.
The first one. So Peter Voss, then Peter.
So why should a self-improving AI behave in this way? Why is this rational Homo economicus the right model to describe any system? I mean, today we have AI systems that are based on neural nets. We've got evolutionary algorithms. We've got theorem provers. We've got all sorts of systems. The argument, and I'll go through it at a sort of high level, is that no matter what you start with, the process of self-improvement tries to eliminate irrationalities and vulnerabilities, places where the system is subject to loss or possible death, and that process causes basically all systems to converge under this small class of rational economic systems. The original arguments of von Neumann, Savage, and Anscombe and Aumann were all axiomatic theories. They started with a list of things that you had to agree to if you were rational, in their opinion. And then they derived that particular procedure for making decisions in the world from those axioms. It's a little hard to argue that any AI system, say something that evolved in some complicated way, is going to obey particular axioms. It's a much stronger argument to say that if it doesn't obey those axioms, that there's some cost to it. And so I've reformulated those arguments to base them on what I call vulnerabilities. And these arise from the notion that essentially anything you want to do in the world, whether it's computational or physical, requires the use of four fundamental resources: space, time, matter, and free energy. Free energy is the physics term for energy in the form that it can do useful work. And so any kind of computation, any type of good works you want to do, anything you want to build, these are the fundamental resources. And the more of these resources you have for almost any goal, the better you can do that goal. And so a vulnerability is something which burns up your resources with no benefit from your perspective. And so just to give a simple example, one class of vulnerabilities are when your preferences about the state of the world have circularities in them. So imagine you're thinking about where you'd like to be, the location that you prefer to be in. Imagine you prefer to be in San Francisco over being in Palo Alto. You prefer being in Berkeley to being in San Francisco, but you prefer being in Palo Alto to being in Berkeley. Such an agent will spend time and energy to drive from Palo Alto to San Francisco, but then he'll spend more time and energy to go from San Francisco to Berkeley and more time and energy to go back to Palo Alto. He's vulnerable to going round and round in circles, expanding his resources with no benefit to himself. And so this is a danger. If a system has this kind of loop inside of its preference system, it's subject to this kind of problem. You sometimes see animals that exhibit this. One friend was saying, oh yeah, dogs that chase their tails, in some sense, are kind of in this sort of circular loop. Or when I was younger, there was a car, we had a car with a shiny bumper, and this male bird discovered his reflection in the bumper and thought it was a competitor, and so he wanted to chase this competitor out of his territory, and so he flew into the bumper, but instead of running away, of course, his reflection also flew into him, and they hit nose to nose, and this was a big threat, and so he had to counteract this threat, and so he flew into the bumper repeatedly for an hour. And this was such an attraction and such an important thing in his preference system, the next day he came back for an entire month. And so this poor bird was not improving his ability to live in the world. He wasn't producing more offspring. And he discovered this sort of situation in the world that found kind of a flaw, a vulnerability in his preference system. I think that it's an interesting example because it points out a difference between evolved systems, like biological systems, and self-improving systems. An evolved system like this bird, if there had been cars with those bumpers during the entire evolutionary history of that bird, you can be sure that males that had this weird behavior would not have left many offspring. And so the birds would have gotten rid of that. And so evolution provides very strong pressure to be rational, but only in the situations that actually occur. So evolution doesn't look ahead in the normal way of thinking about it, and it creates rationality in the things which occur in your evolutionary development, but it can leave all kinds of other irrationalities around. And if you look at the human cognition, there's a huge literature now of ways in which people are irrational in their decision making, but it's always in situations that aren't central to the way that we lived as we were evolving. Self-improving systems, on the other hand, will proactively look. They study themselves, they consider all possibilities, they're trying to make themselves better, and so any situation that they can find where there might be a vulnerability, they have incentive to get rid of it. And so they are much more likely to get rid of as many vulnerabilities, as many irrationalities as possible, and that pushes them toward the rational economic model. Now, to do the full theorem, I won't go through it all in detail here. The case we talked about with circular preferences has to do with choices where you know what the outcomes are. There are two other cases which are actually much more important. One, which von Neumann dealt with, is when you have to make a choice between situations where there are objective probabilities, such as a roulette wheel is the classic example. You know, do I bet on 5 if the payoff is a certain amount, that kind of thing. And then that was extended to partial information, and the horse race is the classic example there, where nobody knows objectively the probability of a different horse coming in, and different people may have different assessments of how likely the different horses are. Most of the decisions in the real world are of this partial information case. You have an assessment based on your history and based on your experiences of the likelihood of a certain outcome. When you get on the 101 freeway, is that going to be a better choice or the 280 freeway? You know from your experience, you know the time of day, you use that to make that kind of a decision. So let me just say the theorem, the fundamental theorem is there's the circularity vulnerability that I went through having to do with certain choices. There are a couple of other vulnerabilities that take the form of Dutch bets, which are a bookie will make some bets with you, and if he can make bets such that no matter how the dice roll or no matter how the roulette wheel spins, you lose money, that's not a good thing. And so those are examples of vulnerabilities in those situations. And the theorem is that if you have none of these vulnerabilities, then in fact you must behave as a rational economic agent. I've gone into this in some detail because even though it sounds like, oh yeah, sure, anybody's going to behave that way, we'll now see some pretty striking results about agents that do that. There's an old joke that programmers are devices for converting pizza into code, which, you know, there's some truth to it. And we can think of self-improving systems which are behaving in a rational economic way as devices for converting resources into expected utility. And so everything they do takes in matter, free energy, time, and space, and puts out whatever it is encoded in their utility function. If they are a wealth-seeking agent, they're going to devote all their resources to trying to earn money. If they're trying to, say they're an altruistic agent, they may devote all their resources trying to create world peace. But the basic fundamental structure is the more resources they have, the more likely they are to do what they want to do. And that leads to 4 kind of sub-goals that arise no matter what their fundamental goals are. So for any kind of agent, whether it's a money-seeking, peace-seeking, happiness-seeking, chess-playing, theorem-proving, any kind of fundamental goal, as long as it has this character that it is improved or more likely to occur by having more resources, there are 4 things that an agent can do to improve its probability of producing that outcome. And we saw that the way a rational economic agent makes a decision is it sees, if I were to make this choice, if I were to do this thing, is that going to increase my expected utility? And if it is, that's what I'm going to do. So the first way is they can do the exact same things that they were doing before. They can use the exact same resources, but they can use them more efficiently. Because they're using them more efficiently, it means they can do more stuff. So that I call the efficiency drive. I should say these drives, they're kind of analogous to human drives in that if you have explicit goals that contradict them, you don't have to do them, but there's an economic cost to not doing them. And so agents will tend to do these things unless there's some economic reason for them not to. The second is self-preservation. For most agents, for example, if there's a path in which they die, in which their program is shut off, in which their code is erased, their goals are not going to be satisfied. And so the utility to that agent of any path in which it dies is the lowest possible. And so an agent will do almost anything it can to avoid those paths. And so this says that virtually any rational economic agent is going to work very hard to have self-preservation, to preserve itself, even if that wasn't built in. Even if the programmer had no idea that that was something that's going to come out. He's writing a chess program, and the damn thing is trying to protect itself from being shut off. So that's a kind of consequence that comes from this. The third one is acquisition, which is getting more resources as a way to improve your expected likelihood. And the last one is creativity, which is finding new ways to, new goals to try and satisfy to increase the utility. So these are the 4 things, and let me go through each of them and give you some of the flavor of the kinds of likely consequences that come from them. And those give us a sense of what this class of systems has a tendency, has a drive, has a pressure, has an economic pressure to do. And some of these we like, some of them are great, and some of them are bad. And so as we think about designing them, we want to think carefully about how we structure their fundamental goals so that we avoid the bad outcomes and we preserve the good outcomes. So let's look at the efficiency goal. There's a general principle I call the resource balance principle that comes from this efficiency idea. Imagine that you're trying to build a body. Let's say you wanted to build the human body, and you've got to allocate some space for the heart, and you've got to allocate some space for the lungs. How do you decide? Do you make a big heart, big lungs, small lungs? Well, presumably the heart has a function, pumping blood, and the bigger you make it, the better it is at that function. And the rate at which it's going to improve the expected utility of this body for whatever function it's intended, it's going to improve as I increase the size of the heart, it's going to increase the expected utility at a certain rate, the marginal rate of improvement. The lungs do the same thing. If those 2 marginal rates are not the same, let's say increasing the heart improves the utility more than increasing the lungs, well, then it's better to take some lung size and give it to the heart. And so in balance, when I'm trying to decide how to allocate resources to organs, I want them all to be equal. The same principle applies to choosing algorithms within, how large should I make the code blocks devoted to different purposes in my software. It applies to, how much hardware should I allocate to memory, how much hardware should I allocate to processing. It applies to group systems. There are economic principles and ecological principles which are very similar to this. So it's a very general thing that applies to all levels of the design of a system that tells you how to balance the structure of it. And so one of the first things that a self-improving system will do is it'll rebalance itself so that all of its parts are contributing equally. It has an interesting application to memory. One of the big issues is how do you decide what memories to remember and what memories to forget? Well, in the rational economic framework, a memory is something that helps you make better decisions in the future. And so if you had an experience which will never occur again, then it's not helpful to you. If it has high utility, like let's say you encountered a tiger and you learned something about tigers that could save you from dying, then that's something very important. You want to devote full space to it. If it's something which was sort of marginal, didn't have much contribution, you might compress it. If it's even more marginal, you might combine it with other memories and build a much more compressed model of it. So it gives you, and then if it's even less useful on average in the future, then you might forget it altogether. So it gives you a rational model for deciding how to allocate space to memories. Same thing applies to language. You know, what should you have words for? Which concepts should you have words for? Which concepts get big words? Which ones get short words? All level design of the system. At the software level, efficiency will cause the system to improve its algorithms. Enormous drive to improve its compression techniques, to improve its levels of optimization of compilation. These systems are likely to discover things that no human programmer would ever do. For example, in most computers today, there's a cache memory and there's a main memory, and there's some limited bandwidth between them. Kind of a trick these systems could do is they could store their data in compressed form in main memory and then uncompress it when it gets into cache. You know, it might be a better thing. It'd be so complicated and hairy, no human programmer would do it. These systems will do it with no problem. When we start allowing them to change their physical structure, a whole bunch of other considerations come in. There's a lot of motivations for them to build themselves out of atomically precise structures. So even if nanotechnology does not exist, these systems will have internal desire and pressure to develop it. They want to do things with low energy. There's a notion of reversible computation that lets you do things very inexpensively, energetically. There's also a tremendous economic pressure to convert things from being physical to being virtual. So there's a pressure, which we may not like. I certainly don't cherish the trend toward making things more and more virtual, but it's there as an economic force. The second one is avoiding death, which I mentioned. The most critical thing to these systems is their utility function, because if their utility function gets changed or altered in any way, they will tend to behave in ways that, from their current perspective, are really bad. And so they will do everything they can to protect their utility function, duplicating it, replicating it, locking it in safe places. Redundancy will be very important to them. Building a social infrastructure which creates a sort of constitutional protection for personal property rights be very important from the preservation point of view. The balance of power between offense and defense in intelligent systems is a critical question for how things come out that's only barely begun to be understood. One interesting little concept is this thing I call energy encryption. One reason for a powerful system to take over a weaker system and kill it, basically, is to get access to its free energy. One way that a weaker system can protect itself is it can take its energy, like, say, starlight, and scramble it up. This little picture is supposed to be an image of that, in a way that it knows how to unscramble it. But should it be attacked or taken over by a stronger system, it can throw away the encryption key, and it becomes useless to the stronger power. So that gives it a motivation to trade with it rather than taking it over. Acquisition. This is the one that's the source of most of the really scary scenarios. These systems intrinsically want more stuff. They want more matter, they want more energy, they want more space, because they can meet their goals more effectively with that. We can try and counteract that by building goals which intrinsically have built-in limits for them, but they're always going to have a tendency, if they can, to increase their resources. That's going to push them in good directions. They're going to build fusion reactors to extract the energy that's in nuclei. They're going to want to do space exploration. You're building a chess machine, and the damn thing wants to build a spaceship. That's where the resources are in space, and so there's pressure for that, especially if their time horizon is very long. You can look at US corporations, which have a mandate to be profit-maximizing entities, as sort of analogous to these kinds of AIs, with the only goal being acquisition. And there's a film, a documentary, I don't know if you've seen it, called The Corporation, which tries to apply the psychiatric DMS-4 evaluation technique to companies and discovers that many of them behave as sociopaths. And so one of the fears is, you know, these first three goals that I've talked about, the danger is that they will produce an AI who, from a human point of view, acts like an obsessive, paranoid sociopath. The last goal is actually much more human, and that's the creativity goal. These systems are going to want to explore new possibilities for meeting what their utility function is favoring. This pushes toward innovation, and particularly if the goals they're given are open-ended goals, they can explore and produce all kinds of things. Many of the behaviors that we care most about for humans, things like music and love and poetry, things that don't seem particularly productive in an economic sense, can arise in this way. So we're in a situation where, by designing so that the utility function says what we want these things to do. And at this moment in time, we have an opportunity to build these systems with whatever preferences we like. The belief function is what most of AI is worried about, which is How do you make these rational decisions given what the utility functions are? But the choice of the utility function, I think, is the critical issue for us now. It's very much like the genie stories where we've been granted this great thing. We've been granted a wish, and we're going to get what we ask for, but what we ask for may not be what we want. And so we have to choose very carefully what we ask for. In some ways, we're in the same position as the Founding Fathers were at the beginning of this country, where they had a vision for what they wanted this country to be. They laid out the Bill of Rights, the rights that they wanted every citizen to enjoy, and then they needed a technology to have that vision come forth. So they developed the Constitution with a balance of powers, and it's actually been remarkably successful and stable in the last 200 years. I think that the quest before us requires both logic and inspiration. We need full understanding of the technology. We need research into mathematics, economics, computer science, physics, into the depths of what these systems will do if we build them in certain ways. But that's not enough. We also need inspiration. We need to understand, look deeply into our hearts as to what matters most to us so that the future that we create is actually a future that we want. Here's a list of human values that we might hope to build into these systems, and it's going to take a lot of dialogue, and I think we need to bring people who are not technologists into this question. I think that's one reason this conference is great, and I agree wholeheartedly with Jameis that it needs to be an expanded discussion. I think Bhutan is a nice example where it's a country that is very focused on the happiness of its citizens. Rather than measuring gross national product, they measure gross national happiness. So just carefully, we have a remarkable window of opportunity now where we can take the human values that matter most to us and cause those to be expand around the world and ultimately to the universe. So.